Hello and welcome to Hamilton, the podcast. I'm Vinton Bayne.
And I'm Robbie Hurlocker.
Before we start our episode today, we just want to say a quick thank you to everyone who's been talking to us on Twitter. We've been getting a lot of nice comments, a lot of nice reviews on iTunes, and a lot of listens.
Yeah, thank you so much for tuning in and sticking around for this long. It's been a blast to get to talk about Hamilton, the musical, to talk about history and share our passion with all of you. And it's been great to hear from you as well. So we'd love to hear more. Leave a review on iTunes or shoot us a message on Twitter. If you're not on Twitter, hit us up on Facebook at the Graphomania podcast page. Everybody has Facebook, right?
No.
No? What?
So the first song we're going to look at is Stay Alive.
Isn't that the one they tell you to do chest compressions to in CPR? Staying alive, staying alive.
I think so, but I'm not sure that has anything to do with the one we're going to talk about.
Different
today.
song? Okay, I'm sorry.
Different song. So historically, we have a bit of a time jump here, like we've seen before in the musical. All of these events took place between 1777 and 1779, so 3 years almost before the wedding.
Yeah, I really like the artistic license here, though, because since they had the wedding before these events, you get to see Eliza start the song off singing over the men, Stay Alive, and then all of the women in the ensemble get together. Angelica joins them, and they sing over all of the guys going off to war, Stay Alive. It's like their collective wish for their brothers and their sons that are going off to battle.
Yeah, for sure. So as the song starts, you hear a gunshot. And in the staging of that, there's a British soldier on the stage. I think he's twirling his rifle around or something. And they have a person actually playing the bullet whenever a bullet's fired, at least in a couple of key moments in the musical. And this is one of those moments when that shot is fired, a person comes up and is the bullet going past, and it goes past Hamilton, who's sitting at his writing desk writing these first few lines.
Yeah, that's really a really neat effect to see that slow motion bullet crossing the stage like that. I like that. It's also a reminder that the war didn't have to end the way that it did. Every single one of these people that we're celebrating in this musical could have died at any moment. A stray gunshot could have taken any of their lives, and it would have been a much different outcome for the war.
So this song starts off here at Valley Forge. And this was a dark moment for the Continental Army. There was a hard winter, and smallpox was breaking out. Mm-hmm. These soldiers were not having a good time of it.
Yeah, war is always hard anyways, but this was about as hard as it could possibly be for those soldiers at the time.
Hamilton says, "I have never seen the general so despondent." Washington here is having a hard time of it as well, hard time leading, and Congress is not helping this. They're not answering the requests that the army has, and they don't actually trust Washington for a large part. They're sending people down there to watch him and see if he's doing all right in this leading.
Even if Congress did want to give him absolutely everything that Washington's heart desired, they wouldn't even be able to afford it because, remember, the Constitutional Congress couldn't actually demand taxation. The states got to decide whether they wanted to give money or not.
Yeah.
So remember, Hamilton and Washington will eventually become the leaders in the Federalist Party, where they want to establish a strong central government because they've had to deal with what it's like to be leading the army in the middle of a weak central government that can't actually raise the funds they need. And on top of the fact that the Congress was weak on its own, the continental dollar was already starting to lose value. I read in one of John Ferling's books, it's called Jefferson and Hamilton, The Rivalry That Forged a Nation. I read that the continental dollar had actually depreciated down to an eighth of what it was normally at. And then within a month period in 1779, it actually went down at a certain point to 2 cents on the dollar.
Wow.
It was the fastest rate of depreciation in U.S. history, faster than the 1930s and the Great Depression, actually, just by proportional amounts.
It's got to be really hard to try to start a new country and then come up with a currency when you're in the middle of a war trying to earn your freedom. There's nothing really to back that up. I can see that being really difficult and how it could depreciate and just fall apart like it actually does here.
Yeah, so the local merchants are denying their equipment. They're not taking the continental dollars because they're not even sure if the continental dollar is going to be worth anything at all in a few months. Like if the French don't show up and actually support their forces, they're going down. You know, it's interesting to me, when we think about war times, we think about the good guys versus the bad guys. We think about this group versus that group. But really, Washington didn't just have to fight against the British forces. He had the political structure that he was also battling at the same time. And so he was fighting against his political rivals as fervently as he was fighting against the British at times.
Yep.
This guy named Thomas Conway, who's going to come up again later in this song, was actually writing letters to Congress, and he was rallying a bunch of enemies, political enemies of George Washington. And this thing that they started calling the Conway Cabal was where a lot of Washington's enemies were starting to attack Washington, declaring that he was indecisive, declaring that he had all these bad defeats under his belt, and he was not fit for service. And so he was having to defend himself politically in front of these people who should have been supporting him. And one of the big political rivals that we're going to see in a moment is none other than Charles Lee, and we'll talk about him shortly.
We see Congress wanting Washington to go out and fight and win these battles, but then Hamilton has to reply, we've resorted to eating our horses. These people are starving. There's one of the soldiers named Joseph Martin who anonymously wrote this book, Narrative of a Revolutionary Soldier. And in it he says, we are absolutely literally starved. I do solemnly declare that I did not put a single morsel of victuals into my mouth for 4 days and as many nights, except for a little black birch bark, which I gnawed off a stick of wood. I saw several men roast their old shoes and eat them, and I was afterward informed by one of the officer's waiters that some of the officers killed a favorite little dog that belonged to one of them.
No.
They're starving so much they're cooking their shoes to eat them.
So gross. So because of all of these big struggles that they were dealing with at the time, Washington comes in and he says, there's only one possible path to success here. There's only one way for us to win this, and they have to resort to guerrilla warfare, to a Fabian warfare strategy.
Yeah, provoke outrage, don't engage, strike by night, remain relentless till their troops take flight. They know that they're outnumbered, outmanned. These soldiers on the British side are trained better. They're more equipped for war. The only chance they have is to just kind of sneak in and get those pop shots that they can off of these soldiers with as much cover as possible. They can't just go outright to war, man to man.
And Washington really wanted to be able to do an all-out attack. There were a couple moments where he specifically wanted to engage the British forces in mass, but he never had that opportunity because his forces were unable to rise to that challenge.
So they use these small, quick raids, hoping to prolong the war as long as possible so that Parliament will eventually decide that this is costing too much money and they'll withdraw.
And so you see him summarizing that entire strategy. You got to outrun the enemy and you have to outlast the enemy. It's not just outright defeat every single one of them. It's we just have to last longer than they're willing to pay for this war.
Yeah, you see Washington's reoccurring usage of the word outmanned, outgunned, outplanned, outrun, outlast, outrage, outright. He likes that a lot.
That's good.
So Washington says, we're going to fly a lot of flags half-mast. And I think that's an interesting point. It's been commented on that we won this war by not losing. We might have won the war, but it was at a great cost. We lost a lot of men. We were not ready to go to war with the British. Then we get that line again, raise a glass. And I think that's a callback to the previous songs where we saw them make this dedication to the war, knowing what it could cost them, knowing the hardships they go through. That's almost a callback letting us know we expected this. We knew this was going to happen. We knew these were the troubles we were going to see.
Yeah, it's definitely a theme going through this all the way from the story of tonight into this particular song where you see the brotherhood and the camaraderie of these soldiers fighting alongside one another with mutual respect, raising a glass to one another. They're very much comrades in arms and brothers.
So now we begin to hear from Hamilton's friends and what they're going to be doing. Mulligan says, I go back to New York in my apprenticeship. Historically, he wasn't actually out there fighting. He was in New York the whole time.
But if he wasn't out there, who was saying, brah, brah?
I think those were the guns they were shooting.
Oh, that's not as fun. And then Marquis de Lafayette says what he's doing. I ask for French aid. I pray that France has sent a ship.
And we would not have made it through this war if it wasn't for the French. They send a lot of supplies and a lot of troops to help us out.
Right. And this is a really pivotal time in the war, as we've been talking about. And this promise for French aid is the one thing that's keeping a lot of the revolutionary parties optimistic about the outcome of this war.
So Lawrence says he stays at work with Hamilton, and they write essays against slavery. Remember, it was Lauren's idea to have black battalions and promise them their freedom if they would fight in the war, but that got denied from him, and then the British ended up taking that idea.
Right, and it was specifically the South Carolina Congress that rejected that idea. A couple of the northern states did implement some variations of those strategies, but not to the same degree. It's worth noting that John Lawrence actually got a lot of his passion to be an abolitionist from when he was studying overseas in England and in Geneva, and he was actually studying there, and he kind of got into this school of thought that he basically understood that any slave who was able to escape to Europe automatically became freed, earned their freedom simply by escaping to Europe.
Yeah, he wrote, "We have sunk the Africans and their descendants below the standard of humanity, and almost rendered them incapable of the blessing which equal heaven bestowed upon us all." He continued that fight to abolish slavery, and he actually often went to the South and talked to the leaders down there to try to convince them of this. It didn't usually end well for him, and he wrote, "I will do as much as I can in my time and leave the rest to a better hand. I perceive that the work before me is great."
And it is, John Lawrence. It is great.
It would be a while after this before that would actually see fruition.
It's really sad how long it took for slavery to be abolished in the United States. And I know that this is getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but since you did bring up a couple of those John Lawrence quotes about slavery in general, it's worth noting in this context, a couple songs from now, the one deleted scene from this particular musical comes after Dear Theodosia and before the song Nonstop, where Hamilton receives a letter from John Lawrence's father, Henry Lawrence, right? Who's the leader of the Continental Congress at the time, or had been, and he was eventually replaced. But Lawrence receives a letter, and Eliza reads it, and the contents of the letter say, "On Tuesday the 27th, my son was killed in a gunfight against British troops retreating from South Carolina. The war was already over. As you know, John dreamed of emancipating and recruiting 3,000 men for the first all-black military regiment. His dream of freedom for these men dies with him."
Oh, man.
So sad, but he definitely had this dream that was ahead of its time, and it is heartbreaking how it went unfulfilled in his lifetime.
So in the next line, he mentions, "Every day is a test of their camaraderie and bravery." And just a specific little quote on that, on Hamilton's bravery, Lawrence wrote, "It was not his fault that he was not killed or wounded. He did everything that was necessary to procure one or the other."
Nice. Speaking of some of those things that he did that may have been perceived as foolhardy or rushing into dangerous areas, he cut supply lines, he stole contraband from the enemy. So we were talking about how undersupplied and underfed the army was. At a certain point, the soldiers decided that they were going to actually go across enemy lines and steal the British supplies themselves.
So again, we see Hamilton wanting command and asking for it from Washington here, and yet Washington dismisses him out of hand. And you'll see this coming up over and over again through the next three songs. But right here, he promotes instead Charles Lee. Robbie, what can you tell us about Charles Lee?
Yeah, when I listened to this musical for the first time, I think a lot of people have this response. You see that Charles Lee is introduced, and he's like, "I'm a general, wee!" Like this kid on a roller coaster, and he's going to a theme park for the first time. Like a child is in charge of the military now. And I think the actor kind of plays that up a lot, and it's supposed to be that way. It's funny. But really, this is a military veteran. He's an immigrant from England who had led a lot of British troops into battle. So he was not a peer of Hamilton. He was actually almost a couple decades older than Hamilton, and was on par with George Washington.
Yeah, he had thought he was going to become commander-in-chief, but Washington had gotten that role instead, and he was actually had a lot of disdain for Washington because of this.
Yeah, there were a lot of people in the military that thought that Charles Lee should be in charge instead of him. There was also a faction of the government that thought that Major General Horatio Gates should be in charge instead. So that's back to this political strife that we had in this context that we talked about earlier, where there are a lot of people that are vying for the commander-in-chief role that Washington secured himself. So Charles Lee is specifically made the second in command. And at this point in time, leading up into the Battle of Monmouth, Charles Lee is not a new player in the Revolutionary War.
No.
He's actually been around for a while, but he's been missing in action because you remember that whole Battle of Long Island scene that we had where Admiral Howe's troops were surrounding Manhattan? During that time, Charles Lee was actually in charge of the largest number of Continental troops just on the other side of New Jersey and the other side of the Hudson River. And he was not willing to come to Washington's aid when he called him at a certain point. He basically was challenging his commander-in-chief's orders a couple different times. Never outright in a way that could be completely seen as subordination, but always with, well, you know what? There are a lot of British forces I absolutely need to take out here, so instead of going over there to act like we're going to take care of Pennsylvania and New Jersey, we're instead going to stay on our side of the river and leave you to your own doing.
Right.
But there was a point shortly after the Battle of Long Island where George Washington knew that General Lee's troops were coming down, and he knew that there was another Continental battalion in a certain area of New Jersey, and he thought strategically about it all, and he actually offered to let General Lee take and join his forces with the large Continental force on the other side of the state in order to basically deal a very decisive blow to the British troops. It could have been one of the biggest defeats of British soldiers in the wartime. But on the day when George Washington expected for Charles Lee to send a letter to him announcing that he had joined troops with the other army and he was ready to attack the British, Washington instead receives a letter from Charles Lee's people, his soldiers, and the letter says that while General Lee was actually a couple miles away from his own army in a little inn ran by a pretty widow, he was captured by the British forces. And so people look at him as he was sleeping on the job, probably sleeping around a little bit, and he was off on his own enjoying the spoils that came from being in charge of all these great things. And the British caught him, and he spent the next year and a half as a prisoner of war.
Yeah, I don't know if there's any truth to it, but there was a rumor at the time that he had been coerced by the British and came back as a traitor, as a spy for them to kind of bring some ruin to Washington in this and to help the British win the war.
Yeah, I actually remember reading about that too in James Thomas Flexner's biography about Washington, The Indispensable Man. I really wanted to read more of this, and I can't wait to read more of it and get into it. But there were these reports where basically the author was saying that if Washington had known about all of the betrayal and all the information that General Lee had provided to the British during that time, he might have been able to actually charge him as a war criminal and a traitor to the cause at that period of history, but instead he didn't know about those things. So even though he knew he had been personally insulted and personally had been treated in a subordinate way by General Lee, he was happy in that moment to have this military wizard, this military veteran back on his side.
During this time where Lee is captured, Washington recruits Frederick von Steuben, and I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, but this is a German man who actually didn't even speak English. They actually had to translate his commands multiple times from German to French to English to get them through to the troops. But he came in to Valley Forge, actually, and we talked about how hard things were there for the troops. There was a lot of uncleanliness going on, a lot of sickness. He actually brought a lot of hygiene in and taught these soldiers how to take care of themselves. And one of the interesting things he taught them was how to use their bayonets as weapons, because they were just using them to cook food at the time.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So he actually got these troops in line. He wrote a military manual and was helping train the troops up to become good soldiers. These weren't, as we've mentioned, trained soldiers to begin with. These are farmers. These are just general civilians who are trying to fight this war for their new country.
Yeah, and one of the things Flexner points out is he says that George Washington really wanted to impress General Lee as he was returning back with all of the progress that Steuben had helped him maintain with the discipline of the army. He thought that the army had made such an improvement in this year and a half. Yeah, they were citizen farmers who had taken up their guns, but with Steuben's help, he thought that they were now ready to take on the British in an all-out combat.
But Charles Lee did not share Washington's optimism about the troops.
No, not at all. So George Washington is preparing for the Battle of Monmouth, and he calls a council of war where he gets all of his major generals together, and they all put in input about whether they would be ready to attack the British forces in the combat. And almost unanimously, all of Washington's generals say, "We are not ready for this."
Oh, man.
And Washington listens to all this criticism. As Flexner's biography reports, Lee was instantly on his feet. He insisted that the inexpert Americans were merely a morsel for the British. And he points out, why, when a French alliance was impending, should we risk disaster? We should just wait for it. Like, this is the Burr attitude
Yeah.
being expressed by Washington's general, saying, let's just wait for the French to get here. Let's lie in wait until they arrive. Then we'll attack them in force.
Yeah, and Burr was a Charles Lee supporter in this argument.
Yeah, even when Charles Lee was court-martialed, Aaron Burr expected to be summoned to his defense and to be on his side. There was a letter back and forth between them where Aaron Burr basically did defend Charles Lee's position.
But despite this opposition, Washington, even though he didn't want to overrule these people and go against what they had advised, he decided that this was the time to attack. This was the moment that they needed. And he was going to command his troops to go and attack the British here. And we'll see this in the song, this attack, everyone attack. And then Lee calling back, retreat. And then Washington, attack. And then Lee, retreat. And this back and forth that you see where Lee refuses to follow the commands and instead tries to do it his own way and come up with his own plan of retreat and regroup and find a different way to attack these soldiers when Washington's wanting an all-out attack here.
Yeah, so it's interesting to me that because Lee was so opposed to this plan, he almost didn't agree to lead the forces into Monmouth at all. So Washington looks over to Lafayette and says, okay, well, you can take the troops in instead. And it was kind of a last-minute decision when Lee said, okay, I'll take over. I'll do my job as the second in command. I'll lead these troops. So you see that in the song itself, where Washington is commanding the troops to attack. Lee is saying, you need to retreat. This is what we should do. We should fall back. It's not a safe plan to attack. You see they're going back and forth, back and forth. Washington finally looks at Lee and says, I'm sorry, is this not your speed? Are you not able to live up to this thing? And he looks at Hamilton, and in a moment that you think, like, I almost imagine Hamilton's eyes getting wide with optimism. We think this is his moment. He's been asking for a command this whole time, and he says, this isn't your speed. So Hamilton, and his response is, ready, sir.
Have Lafayette take the lead. So he goes back to his original choice. And it's interesting, this part in the lyrics, I'm sorry, is this not your speed? Washington actually did confront Lee while he was retreating. He rode up to him, and apparently he used such coarse language that an officer recorded, he swore till the leaves shook on the trees, and like an angel from heaven.
Oh, man.
Which Washington wasn't known for using a lot of foul language. So I'm not sure what this here means, but I wish we could go back and listen to Washington having this confrontation.
Yeah, I wish I could be in the room where that happened.
So in the conclusion of this battle, we see it kind of ends in a stalemate here. There's a bit of a political victory because the British finally retreat, but both sides lose a lot of soldiers. It says 1,000 soldiers die in 100-degree heat, but that's a little bit of an exaggeration. There's actually 1,000 dead, wounded, and missing.
Yeah, all combined together.
And after this battle, we see Charles Lee trying to defend himself by trash-talking Washington.
It's actually court-martialed for his insubordination of not following orders, and he's actually accused of a cowardly retreat. Hamilton testifies against Charles Lee, as you'd expect him to do, as he opens his mouth and is always hurling insults at his enemies. He does so here, where he actively is testifying against Charles Lee's character, and in turn, Charles Lee is attacking Washington, saying things like, Washington cannot be left alone to his devices. He's indecisive from crisis to crisis. And then in the song, they actually paraphrase something that Charles Lee actually said, where he was writing a letter to one of his friends, and he basically explained, I might just retire from the army and go down and start becoming a tobacco farmer, because apparently that prepares you to be the commander-in-chief of all the continental forces, taking a huge jab at George Washington sarcastically. And so he's actively antagonistic to Washington's character.
And Lawrence and Hamilton don't appreciate this. They say something has to be done about what he's saying. And Lawrence challenges him to a duel.
And that's a really interesting development, because usually, according to the Code Duellum, the basic rules of issuing a duel, which we'll go into in a second, you could only initiate a duel if your own honor was challenged.
Right.
If you were actually attacked, you could go into this initiating an affair of honor to say, my honor was challenged, and you could stand up for yourself. Alternately, you could stand up for your family's honor. If your father was challenged, like you'll see Philip later standing up for his own father's family honor, he feels like that's a moment where he's attacked. John Lawrence, according to a lot of people, didn't have the right to stand up to defend Washington's honor. But John Lawrence writes this defense of himself, basically saying that because I am one of his aides, because I am tied so closely to General Washington, I have a stake in his honor. And in a manner of speaking, he's almost like he's claiming George Washington as a father figure.
Which is interesting because Washington had no biological children, and he actually had this paternal care for his subordinates. He treated them like sons. He cared for them that way, and he talked to them that way. And we'll see that come up later with Hamilton at the end here.
Yeah, and Hamilton is not exactly excited about that.
No. So we go right into the next song, 10 Duel Commandments, which is a clear reference and clearly inspired throughout the thing by Notorious B.I.G.'s The 10 Crack Commandments.
Yeah.
Both these songs are from the 90s, one 1790s, one 1990s, and they're how-to guides for illegal activity.
Yeah, dueling was very common in that time, but it was not legal.
Right. And actually, I found an interesting note on how common it was. It was mostly only common with military men because in the military, there was this big thing with honor. You only saw 2 to 3 duels a year, but they were almost always military men.
Oh, interesting. So you'll hear this called the Code Duellum or the Code Duello. It comes from duo bellum, the duo being 2, bellum being war. Look at that. My 3 years of Latin in high school is finally paying off. So the duo... the Code Duello is just this list of rules that pretty much every organized affair of honor, whenever your honor was challenged and you wanted to challenge someone to a duel, you'd go through these steps specifically.
Right. This wasn't just 2 people going outside of a bar and drunkenly shooting each other. There were specific rules to be followed so that you could do this in an honorable fashion.
Right, exactly. And so every affair of honor was slightly different because the way that they were negotiated or the way they tried to find peace with one another was often done in a way that just worked towards the situation, but it did always follow a specific pattern. And in this song, they've reduced the specific rules down into 10 commandments that basically show us how duels in this particular musical are supposed to work.
And the brilliant part about this is while they're telling us the rules, while they're explaining it to us, the story's going on. It's telling us the story at the same time. Usually you get the rules and then you jump into the thing, but this is doing both at the same time, which is really brilliant lyric work.
Yeah, exactly. I love that we get to see the duel taking place as they explain it to us.
So number 1.
The challenge, demand satisfaction. So really simple, go up to the person that's offended your honor and tell them, hey, you offended my honor. I need an apology.
Yeah, so you see satisfaction in a new context here, but it's directly related to Hamilton in this musical and how it's going to end, where there's going to be this duel where Hamilton's not satisfied.
I can't get no satisfaction.
Number 2.
If they don't apologize to you for offending your honor, then the next step in the duel is to go and grab a friend to be on your side.
Yeah, this is basically a second person to try to mediate a peace here. And if not, then they can actually step in and duel for you under certain circumstances as well.
Mm-hmm.
Here, obviously, Hamilton is Lauren's second. And in the musical, Burr is Charles Lee's second. But that's not actually the way it was in history.
Yeah, even though Charles Lee and Aaron Burr did have a respectful relationship with one another, and Burr was prepared to defend Charles Lee in the court-martial case, he did not step up as his specific second in the duel. He just conveniently is placed here in the musical because it makes a fantastic parallel to the final duel where Hamilton and Burr are facing each other not as seconds representing other people, but they're actually the primary parties of the final duel in this musical. So number 3 is to get your seconds face to face so that they can actually put together the peace treaty. So this is one of the stages of the duels that actually takes the longest most of the time because one second will deliver the demands to the other and they'll say, well, will your guy apologize if he just says this many things? Or if I do this much and apologize for this, will you apologize for that? And so this back and forth is basically to try to negotiate terms of agreement where they can say, okay, my honor won't be so slammed if you will actually say this thing, and then if you back down on this, then I'm willing to respect you on that. And so this negotiating a peace is what takes the majority of the duel.
Yeah, that's what Burr would say that part is for, but Hamilton is a little bit too rash for that. He would say it's just to negotiate a time and place, which you see in the musical. Burr's the one that says negotiate the peace, and Hamilton's the one that says or negotiate a time and place.
Right. Yeah, and that's a good point about Burr's attitude specifically towards duels, because he does go on and he says, this whole thing is commonplace, especially between new recruits in the military. People are firing off their guns in the middle of camp. People are insulting one another because they're not a disciplined military specifically. They're always going to be fighting with one another. There's a lot of infighting in the Continental Army. And so Burr understands that this is a normal little thing, but most disputes will die without actually getting to the final stage of firing shots towards one another.
You wouldn't know that by listening to this musical, though. We have 3 duels and shots fired in every one.
That's very true. So number 4.
Number 4, you got to bring the doctor. And so an interesting thing about the doctor, he has to have deniability. Otherwise, he can get in trouble for this as well. So here they have him turn his back so he's not looking at them. But in history, he actually would stay a little bit farther away so we could just barely hear a cry for help. And then he would come running in and act like, oh, I just heard this cry for help. I just happened to be passing by.
Yeah, this total crazy random happenstance.
Number 5, duel before the sun is in the sky. You want to duel when the sun's just coming up. That way, I guess you have the night to think about it, and then the sun's not going to be in anyone's eyes. You can have it kind of even. No one can use that as an excuse.
Right. So 5 is like pick the place and pick the time specifically so you can have a good location and do it at the right time of day.
Number 6.
Number 6 is you leave a note for your next of kin. So in the final duel, you'll see that Hamilton sits down and he writes a note to Eliza. And it's a very heartwarming, heartbreaking note that you see, and we'll talk about that when we get to the second act. But here in this particular staging, all you get to see is John Lawrence hands a piece of paper to Hamilton as he's singing this, and Hamilton sticks it in his jacket, and he's like, just basically this part of the musical, this part of the rules to a duel is, hey, set your affairs in order, because you might not have tomorrow, so leave a note for all the people you care about and put your affairs in order.
Wrapping up 6 and going into 7, say your prayers and confess your sins. Number 8.
This is the last chance that you have to actually end this peacefully. You send in your seconds, see if they can finally negotiate this. And so Hamilton and Burr come towards each other at the center of the stage, and you see them do their typical response towards one another. Alexander!
Aaron Burr, sir.
Can we agree that duels are dumb and immature?
Sure. Which is real funny. That's how this whole thing ends. Here they are saying duels are dumb, as if they'd never participate.
Yeah, I would never do something as immature as a duel.
Which is funny that Burr is the one who initiates that, and yet he's the one who calls for the duel in the end.
Yeah, they definitely do kind of swap roles slightly, learning from one another as life goes on. But in this particular context, Hamilton is insistent that Charles Lee has to be held accountable for all of these terrible things he's said about George Washington. He says he has to be held accountable, but Burr insists, is this really worth dying for? Is this really something that he should be held so highly accountable for that you're willing to kill him for it? And Hamilton's response is, hang on, didn't a lot of people die when Charles Lee made these bad decisions? Lots of people have already died, and so your man deserves death, essentially, is, I guess, the assumption in the end of that.
Okay, so we're doing this. Number 9, look him in the eye and no higher. There was actually, in the rules, you weren't supposed to shoot up into the sky ever. That was in the Code Duellum. It specifically said that. It said no fake shooting, basically. No shooting up into the sky, no shooting above the eyes. Because if you're at this point, you had your chance to back out. You had your chance either not to call the duel in the first place or to apologize. You shouldn't be shooting off into the sky or holding your gun up.
Yeah, and so all of these steps leading up to this moment are designed for you to make a peaceful resolution with the other person. But if you get to this point in particular, then you care enough about your honor that you are not going to apologize, you're not going to take back what you said, you are going to put your life on the line to stand up against this other person, saying, I am willing to go to bat against you specifically to defend my own name. And so the Code Duello, or Code Duellum, it goes both ways. The words are Latin in origin, so it was used in a lot of different ways at times. But these rules were kind of loosely followed, but they were pretty well understood by most of the soldiers in this area. And so these are the 10 rules or 9 or 10 rules, depending on how you count them out, where Lin-Manuel has said, this is how duels work in my musical. So at this point, you take your 10 paces and you fire towards one another. And this particular scene ends when Charles Lee takes a bullet in the side.
Yeah, I like this actual very last part where the number 10 is number 10, paces fire. Number 10 is the fire.
Yeah.
And that takes us right into the next song, Meet Me Inside, which, as you said, in the song, Lee gets shot in the side here. And in history, he was shot in the side, but it just grazed him. And both Lawrence and Lee wanted to shoot again. They wanted a second shot. But Hamilton, very uncharacteristically, along with the other second, talked them out of it. They said, this duel's done. Let's be done with this. And they convinced them to stop. And on the walk home, supposedly, Lawrence and Lee are able to reconcile somewhat.
Yeah, and I've heard a few different accounts on when that happened. One account specifically, Lee gets shot in the side, it gets grazed, and then he specifically says, oh my goodness, this isn't worth it. It isn't worth losing my life. I am ready to issue an apology for everything bad I ever said against Washington. He was a good man, and he writes these things in the paper, and he basically apologizes for this at that point. Whatever happened at the end of the duel, we know that they parted on fairly good terms. They both had their honor intact, and Charles Lee did issue an official apology towards Washington, recanting some of the things he had said about him.
If only the Hamilton-Burr duel had ended that way. How different would history be?
Oh man, just to imagine all of that it's really interesting. Even though Alexander Hamilton would participate in a number of more duels throughout his life as a second, specifically trying to negotiate peace, this is one of his first, where he gets to see that it ends with a peaceful solution in the end. Yeah, the shots were fired, but everything was resolved with honor intact. Everything was resolved with people making peace with one another. So if this was ingrained in his mind, he was probably affected by this optimistic outcome of a duel.
Yeah. But here in the song, it seems like the wound is a little more severe. You get a little more hectic. This song actually starts out in the 7/8 time signature to give it this uneasy feeling. They make it a little bit more urgent, seeming how wounded Lee is. Get him off the field. Get a medic.
It's distorted.
Yeah. And Lawrence says, I'm satisfied.
But if John Lawrence was satisfied with the outcome, there comes one person walking down the field who will not be very satisfied with what just happened in his troops. Here comes the general. And Aaron Burr, you just have to know he's exasperated as he says, this should be fun.
Yeah, you almost get this idea of kids outside fighting and dad shows up.
Daddy's calling.
At this point, Washington thanks Lee for his service, very characteristically of him, always trying to be congenial and give honor and keeping his cool and giving respect, and always wanting to seek compromise and peace.
Yeah, I absolutely love how Lin-Manuel Miranda is able to capture this fantastic version of George Washington, who, yeah, he does lose his cool every now and then, but by and large, he is an absolutely heroic figure that we would all want to be like.
And then he turns to Hamilton and says, meet me inside. And you hear the company come in, meet him inside, meet him inside, which is a clear reference to DMX's Party Up or Up in Here.
Y'all gonna make me lose my cool up in here, up in here.
Yeah, I used to love that song.
Oh, me too. I remember a lot of times cruising down 6th Street in Emporia, Kansas, the windows down with my stepsister. We thought we were so cool playing this song and a couple other ones, baby, because I'm a thug, as we try to pull up next to old people who are really concerned about our music choices.
You guys are so tough. So now we're going to see Hamilton and Washington kind of coming head to head, and you see their personalities conflicting here. You have Washington, the calmer, cooler, collected person, coming against Hamilton, the person who gives no quarter and was prone to rash behavior. Washington is going to continue over and over to call Hamilton son here, and Hamilton does not take kindly to this. I mentioned earlier that Washington has this paternal care over his subordinates. Well, Hamilton doesn't actually appreciate this. He's a bit prideful, as we know, and he dislikes being in the position of dependence of other people. As a matter of fact, him and Washington were never actually friends, per se. There's this quote here in this letter about his resignation later on in history, where he says, "For 3 years past, I have felt no friendship for him, and professed none."
Yeah, so by the end of their relationship, when Washington finally asks Hamilton to draft his farewell address, I think there's definitely some mutual affection between the two political figures at that point in their lives. But at this time, young Hamilton's basically looking at Washington as a relationship of convenience. He's hitched his wagon to this general that he expects to take him places, and he understands that in order for him to rise up and in order for America to succeed, they need to see a Washington that is a larger-than-life, perfect political figure who's almost untouchable. So historically, their actual falling out was over something really kind of petty. So they were retiring to their cabin one evening, and Washington basically said, "Hey, I need to talk to you." Hamilton said, "Just a sec, I'll be right back up." And Hamilton goes down, deals with his stuff. He comes back up the stairs and sees Washington standing at the top of the stairs, and Washington looks at him like, "You have kept me waiting for a full 10 minutes, and I feel incredibly disrespected." And he basically insulted him. Hamilton said, "Well, if that's how you feel about it, I'm done. I'm going to bed." And Hamilton and him kind of just overreacted because they had had such a long day and they had these clashing personalities and they were both angry with one another. And Hamilton's not the kind of guy that lets a personal attack slip. So while Washington was ready to apologize, Hamilton was ready to send in his resignation letter. And he basically resigned from Washington's staff, but he said, "I know that what I do is really important, so I'm going to stay on board as long as you are still looking for a replacement." And he also wanted to make sure that they parted on as good of terms as possible because he still knew that Washington was his best chance for upward mobility if they could end on good terms. And so in this last conversation for this particular song, he's going to slip in those phrases where he's going to ask one more time for a command of his own. But just like when your parents are actually lecturing you because you are in trouble, that's not the right time to ask for the keys to the car.
Right.
Washington is not okay with Hamilton trying to use this moment to slip in his one last request for getting a command. So they're fighting with one another back and forth in this final dialogue for this song.
So when he says he should have shot him in the mouth, it's kind of an allusion to another John who shot Thomas Conway in the mouth in the duel for maligning Washington.
So in the lead up to the conclusion of this particular song, and the conflict is building, the fighting is getting more and more intense, the volume is raising between these two people, and Hamilton basically is saying, if you just gave me a battalion, a group of people that I could be in charge of, so that I could lead them, then I would have the chance to advance myself in life after the war. And Washington's response is, you know what, if you did have that opportunity in front of you, you could die. And we need you alive. Hamilton repeats that thing he said from the very beginning of the musical. I'm more than willing to die if it brings my name honor. If it brings me legacy, I know that I'm probably going to die on a battlefield in glory. And so he says, I'm more than willing to die. And Washington, who may have some ulterior motives in saying this, says, your wife needs you alive, son. I need you alive.
To which Hamilton gets right in his face and says, call me son one more time.
It's such a raw, emotional shout in that moment.
Yeah.
It's just these guys are at their wits' end. They've had as much as they can handle of one another.
Which, calling back to all the times he's called him son, there were actually rumors being thrown around that Washington actually was the illegitimate father of Hamilton.
Yeah, because a lot of people just knew that Hamilton was not a claimed child. He was an illegitimate child at birth, and they knew that Washington made a trip to the Barbados Islands for a while about the time when Hamilton may have been born, so they put two and two together, and they saw them together a lot, and so most historians debunk that theory completely, say it's completely just hogwash, but yeah, that's is an interesting conspiracy theory that people are throwing around.
Yeah, and as you see, Hamilton saying, I'm not your son. I don't have your name. I don't have your land.
And so to end this entire conflict between the two people, Washington plays the trump card, giving the order as the commander-in-chief of the military. He looks at Alexander and says, go home, Alexander.
Yeah, he loses that paternal tone completely. He says, you want me to act like a commander? I'll act like a commander. Go home. And he says, sir, go home.
So while the historical Hamilton chose to resign from Washington's staff at this period of history, this version of Hamilton in Lin-Manuel Miranda's musical is being sent home against his will.
So next week, we're going to find out what Hamilton finds out when he gets home that actually Washington already knew. Until then, I'm Vinton Bayne at Flesh Eater on Twitter.
And I'm Robbie Hurlocker at Alpha Knight on Twitter. Looking forward to hearing from you.
Remember to rate and subscribe. See you next time. This has been a Graphomania production. If you would like to hear more podcasts, go to graphocast.com, graphocast.com. Follow us on Twitter at Graphocast and like the Graphomania page on Facebook for news and updates.